Hello everyone and welcome to How to Win, a series brought to you by SportsPro Media and the NorthStar Solutions Group to hear firsthand how leading figures in the sports industry were able to lead their organizations to major success across the business of sports. I'm your host, Nick Meacham, CEO of SportsPro, and thrilled to be joined once again by my co-host, Chris Collins, CEO of NorthStar. How are you doing, Chris?
Doing great, Nick. Good to see you again, and really excited for another great session.
We've had some great guests so far, and this guest is a really interesting one for me because I've followed their journey, and in particular his journey through many years and over my time at SportsPro, and it's great to see what he's been able to achieve in his latest role. But I won't be talking too cryptically for too long here, but I thought I'd set the scene a little bit before we get into things. Now, this week's guest is someone that has a very impressive track record in football, but in recent times it's really proven that good leadership, good strategy, and great execution can deliver when it all comes together. And this week's guest is the CEO of Premier League football club, Brighton Hove Albion, who've been holding strong in the Premier League since 2017, whilst many major clubs have come and gone along the way. Their ability to build a strong organisation and approach off the pitch has clearly led to incredible results on it. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Paul Barber to the show. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks, Nick. It's very good to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Now, let's set some context before we jump into some questions for you, Paul. I looked at some of the numbers and some of the where you sit currently on the Premier League table, and obviously the on-field performance of the table is normally the most important measure of success in this industry. But you're currently sitting fifth on the table, above some of the quote-unquote major clubs in the competition around Tottenham, Man United, well-funded also like Newcastle, and a total of 12 other clubs are behind you at the moment. And this isn't a flash in the pan. Obviously, you finished sixth in the 22-23 season. But obviously what you've been able to achieve on the field is linked with, I would say, an over-the-odds performance in terms of your relative stature and scale relative to some of those other incumbents in the league itself. Currently, 13th largest stadium. You're based in Brighton and Hove Albion, Brighton and Hove, which is around a population of 276,000, so not a major market. About 250 million of revenue annually from the figures I've seen, and the club's valued by Forbes is around 730 million, which is 29th in the world behind Austin FC, which I found so very surprising to read that framework. I'm not sure how their approach is to get to that number. But my point is that you've delivered great results for the organisation since you've joined and basically over the odds since you've been leading the organisation. So the question is, Paul, how have you done it? How on earth have you built the club to the levels you have and built not only to deliver results, but in such a consistent basis?
Well, I think like anything else, if you look from the outside, it looks like a fairly straight line of progress over the last decade or just over. But the reality is there's been bumps along the road. There's been some moments where things haven't gone as well for us as we would have liked. But the one thing that's been clear all along is our vision. We've got a very clear vision to be a top 10 Premier League club, a top 4 club in the Women's Super League. And that's almost like our guiding principle. Anything that we do, any decision that we take, any plan that we implement has to be in support of that vision. Otherwise, we don't do it. I think we also work to very clear values. The club has some strong values. We're a values-led organisation, so we make a lot of our decisions. First of all, will they support the vision? Secondly, do they actually support the club's values, which are important to us? And then we've been pretty relentless in executing our strategy in support of the vision and in line with the values. And, any organisation, whether you're a sporting organisation or an organisation in a different industry, needs all of those three things, I think, to be successful. And of course, all of that is underpinned by good people. And, we aim to hire the best possible people we can on and off the field. We don't have, as you said, the biggest budgets. We don't have the biggest city to attract people to, but what we do have is a very well-funded football club that has a very clear way of doing things and a very clear plan for how it intends to do it. And of course, we're very lucky to have an owner like Tony Bloom, who has funded the club superbly. He was a passionate fan of the club, was born in the city, and cares very deeply about the community in which he was raised. So all of those ingredients, help a football club to be successful. And we're still humble about, where we've come from and what we've achieved, because ultimately, we're in a high performance business, and maintaining high performance is a very difficult thing to do when you've got very, very big competition around you.
It's clearly something that in this industry, and particularly in the Premier League, everyone's throwing resource into operating an incredible, successful business. Some clubs spending a bit more excessively than others, perhaps relative to the results they are achieving. How have you found a way to manage the balance of all of that, to manage the balance of where you are spending and investing to deliver both performance on the field, but even performances off the field, which we're talking about, perhaps the commercial side, the fan engagement side, just the operations of the organization itself, because you have so many stakeholders that people often forget about in an organization like that. How do you balance that approach to make sure that everything's firing on all cylinders?
Well, I think sometimes high performance in professional sport, a lot of people just focus on the output of what the team is doing or the athletes are doing. Our approach is a little bit different. We want high performance from every area of the organization, because we see high performance as being the outcome of a number of different inputs, and those inputs are both on the field and off the field. So it means about, for us, having the best revenue streams that we can. The sponsors on the backdrop behind me, haven't just arrived at our club by accident. We've cultivated those relationships. We've built those opportunities for sponsors to engage with us over a number of years. And we're now beginning to realize the value of all of that work. So that's an important input to high performance. Hiring the best people is a really important input to high performance. Having great infrastructure, great facilities is another input. Having clear policies and consistent procedures for how we work with our fans, work with our community, work with our local stakeholders are also inputs to high performance. And if you get all of these things right, then you're giving your teams the best possible chance of success on the field, which is what most people would then consider to be the ultimate output of a high performance culture. But this doesn't happen overnight. This takes a lot of years of hard work and a lot of consistent application of strategy in order to achieve it. And as I said right at the start, it doesn't come in a straight line, unfortunately. There will be bumps in the road. But if you use those bumps in the road to build resilience, then the resilience gives you strength, the strength gives you confidence, the confidence gives you the opportunity then to progress. And, we've been through all of those ups and downs. We have them, in a season multiple times. And we are very, very concerned not to do is to change strategy or change direction just because we hit a bump in the road. For us, that's just a consequence of being in a high performing environment. It's almost impossible to be the best performing team or the best performing club every single week. And you've only got to look at what's happened recently to Manchester City to see how, one of the most highly functioning high performance environments can hit a bad patch. And it doesn't make them suddenly a bad team or bad players, or Pep Guardiola is certainly not a bad coach overnight. It's just one of the things that in a performance based organization, you are going to come across periods when things don't go as well as you'd hoped or as well as you'd planned. And part of the quality of an organization is how you actually overcome those bumps in the road and build the resilience that you need in order to do that. So for us, it's a combination of different things, producing what we hope will be a consistent output over time.
So you talked about bumps in the road, and I think that's one of the things that anyone who's been in a leadership position understands, that there is always no straight line in this industry. Sometimes people get lucky and find some opportunity or organization or industry that might be on some sort of exponential curve of growth, but otherwise you have to constantly manage those bumps. As someone who's running a football club, what are some of those bumps in the road that can take you off path and that you have to adjust and get the team back on track if they come your way?
Well, I mean, they'll be different for different organisations in certainly in this industry. But for a club of our size, losing coaching staff to a competitor, losing players to a rival, losing other staff, non-football staff, non-technical staff at critical times. We're a people-based business, so almost inevitably your biggest bumps in the road will sooner or later be people-based. And similarly on the pitch, if performance drops, it's usually because you've lost players through injury, you've lost players through lack of form, lack of confidence. So again, it comes back to people. We're not manufacturing iPhones or cars or computers. We are, a group of people trying to build an environment that allows a group of other people, athletes, to perform at the highest level in order to entertain another group of people who are the fans. And in the middle of all of that, you've got media and you've got sponsors and you've got other stakeholders who are also, human beings, and therefore will have views on what you're doing and how you're doing it. So for us, there are many, many different sort of potential blips, and our job is to try and create an environment where not only can we withstand those blips, but that we can become resilient from them and actually bring about even higher performance, because we've become stronger through the learning that comes from bumps in the road. And it happens to, as I say, even the best organizations, the highest performing organizations, the most title winning organizations. And for us, we're on a journey, for a very, very large part of Brighton's history, 125 years. The vast majority of that time, in fact, almost 90% of it, has actually been spent outside of the top division of English football. So, we've had to learn the hard way, really, over the last 8 years in the Premier League of what it takes to be a Premier League club. And the first 2 or 3 seasons we were at this level, it was very, very difficult. And our staff had to adapt and evolve and learn and recover quickly from setbacks. Here we are now in our 8th season at this level. And as I said, it looks easier, but it's not. It's actually just as competitive. It's just that we've built a much higher level of resilience and a much higher level of learning throughout and capability throughout the organization to help us manage it better. That doesn't mean to say we've cracked it. It doesn't mean to say that we are going to stay at this level forever. It means that we have to keep working very, very hard to give ourselves the best chance of staying at this level forever. And if we can do that, then relatively speaking, we would have been successful.
The point around people seems to come up a lot in these types of conversations, just how important they are to enabling success. Chris, I want to ask you the question before I throw it at Paul, but from your point of view, working across so many different industries, how do you ensure you've got the right people in place to execute the strategy you want to see executed? Because that seems to be, in the conversation we had last week, I remember that coming up as a key point. So what's your take on how do you ensure those right people are in place?
Right. Well, I think it goes back to a lot of the themes that Paul has been discussing. Clearly understanding your vision, your values, being purpose driven, and understanding what the success factors are for that. Right. And then that will give you, again, we've talked about it a few times, kind of the behavioral types of aspects, the cognitive types of aspects that you need in your people. It'll give you an ability to design teams around those critical success factors and those attributes. And so when you're actually looking at building the team or bringing individuals in, you're bringing them into kind of a blueprint that has been driven by that vision, that analysis of what the critical success factors are. And I think that gives you the best chance of success because now you've got synergies between where you're trying to go, what it's going to take to get there, and the teams that you've formed or what your teams need to look like in order to achieve that, and then the individuals that you're plugging into those teams. A lot of times what I see all the time with other clients is they start with the person, right? They start with a lot of technical attributes of the person and then try to collect a bunch of what they consider to be technically qualified people, but they don't really know how they're fitting into the larger puzzle. And that's where some breakdowns happen. So I think kind of taking that top-down approach and then plugging the people in last once you really understand not just the technical attributes or skills or experience that people need to have, but really the behavioral attributes, the cognitive attributes, especially, Paul's talking about resiliency, which is, couldn't agree more. You've got to have people that are resilient. What are those qualities? What are those characteristics? You have to have people that learn as they go, that don't overly rely on, let's say, stringent processes to ensure performance, but are able to focus more on what the intent is or the purpose is. How do you maintain attachment, alignment to that vision? So, it's really a process that you go through. And if you do that right, then it's easier to build the right teams and then have a structure to ultimately, bring new people into and have them perform.
Paul, what's your view on that and the points that Chris made? Is that align with how you've approached things, or is there anything more specific you want to add to that?
No, I would agree very much, actually, because I think, in our case, our values are real indicators of whether we've got the right people in the organization, and values don't have to be rocket science. In our case, our values are very clear. We aim high. We treat people well. We look to exceed expectations. We act with integrity, and we try and make things special. So every decision that we take, we ask our people to align their decision making with those values. They don't have to hit every one of them every time. But if what they're doing doesn't align with those values, then they're probably doing the wrong thing. And if you've got, in the case of a football club of our size, on a match day, almost 1,000 people acting in the same way, behaving in the same way, working towards a common vision, understanding that the fans are at the center of everything we do and creating a great experience for them is really what our business is. We're in the entertainment business. We want them to come and enjoy live sport, hopefully win the match. But even if we don't win the match, we want them to have had a great day out. So those values allow us to give our people a sense of individuality, so they don't have to follow a script, but they can understand from the organization's point of view what we're expecting them to do. And then, of course, if we get that right on a consistent basis and all areas of the football club are operating at the same high level, leading to the same vision, then our football teams have got the best chance of winning matches, because that's their part in the jigsaw and the picture that we're trying to create. So people are very much at the heart of everything we do and why we do it. And you've got to try and make it as simple as possible for people to do what you need them to do. So don't overcomplicate it. Don't make the values rocket science based. Make them almost common sense. But then when you're hiring people, make sure you're hiring people that buy into the vision and buy into the values, but not just from a tick box exercise point of view. You want them to actually live those values. You don't want them quoting them like a mantra every day. You just want to see their behaviors manifesting themselves in the right way. So from our point of view, that's what we've built the club on over the last certainly 12 and a half years that I've been here. My owner, Tony Bloom, the chairman, has owned the club for just about a year longer than I've been here. He had a very clear vision for what he wanted to achieve, and my job has been to implement that vision and create an environment that brings it alive for real people, because these things sometimes look great on paper. They are great as theories, but you actually have to implement them and make them real. And that's what we're trying to do every day.
So obviously within a club like Brighton, Hove Albion, you've got a lot of moving parts, as we've talked about before. You've got the performance stuff, the on-pitch performance, the training, everything goes there. Then you've got all the other parts to the organisation, which sometimes people, again, they just point to the performance, but they don't think about all those other factors. Just could you talk through, give a bit of a sense of how the organisation's structured from that standpoint to manage, whether it's the fan engagement bit, the stadia part, the sales and marketing bit. How are you structured internally to manage that? And how do you balance your time across all those different verticals? Because they have such different areas that people to be focused on. The performance isn't a typical area you marry against other sectors, a different set of skills, a different sort of understanding. So how are you balancing all those?
Yeah, I mean, the football industry, and particularly in the Premier League in England, is a strange beast in many ways, because if you look at the size of our businesses relative to a car manufacturer or Apple Computers or a big bank, we're pretty small businesses. But the real difference is that we've got a gigantic profile. Everything we do, everything we say is scrutinized to a very, very high degree. No one gets on the train to go to work in the morning and talks about their bank account. But they do talk about their football team. No one gets up in the morning in a bad mood because, the car hasn't necessarily, performed as well as they would have hoped the day before. But if the football team hasn't performed as well as they hoped the day before, they are in a bad mood that morning. So we have an impact on people's lives which is quite different and disproportionate in many ways to the size of our organization. And then, as I mentioned before, we're people-based. So we rely on human beings in every aspect of what we do. And one of the biggest challenges, I think, for anyone running a football club in the Premier League is that we've got multiple sites. We've got a stadium site, we've got a training ground site. Most clubs have got a building where they've got their charitable foundation based, and they might even have one or two other buildings in their portfolio as well. And trying to harmonize the culture across those different parts of the estate can be quite tricky, because you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of staff. And within those hundreds of staff, you've got many specialisms. So at one end, you've got the elite athletes. At another end, you might have a bunch of professional medical staff. In the middle, you've got professional ground staff, HR, finance, marketing, sales. There are so many different professions under one roof. And again, people will come at all of their jobs in their particular narrow way. And our job is to try and make sure that we can harmonize all of those different groups to achieve a consistent outcome on the field week in, week out. And the biggest part of my job, is literally, if I see all of those different constituents within the club as parts of an orchestra, is actually getting them to play together at the right time in the right way in order to entertain the audience. And very, very big part of that orchestra, if I use that analogy for one final time, are the players, the athletes. We need to make sure that we're creating an environment, whether we're working at the stadium, the training ground, within the charitable foundation, within our new fan zone, which is being built just outside this stadium as we speak. I need all of those different parts to come together to give the players the best chance of actually winning on a Saturday afternoon. And if they do, then the rest of the organisation benefits from that, because it's much easier to run a football club that's winning football matches than it is if it's not. And it sounds obvious, but until you've experienced both, you don't realise quite how difficult it is to run a football club if you're not winning matches, because every stakeholder, everyone that's got an interest in the club, everyone that cares about the club will have an opinion that's far greater and far louder, and in some cases far more complex if the team's losing than if they're winning. If they're winning, they trust the managers, they trust the coaches, they trust the players. If they're not winning, then everybody's got an opinion on why they should be and what's not happening in order for that to be the case. So, this football business looks from the outside in relatively simple, but on the inside it can be quite complex and it can be quite challenging, mainly because it's all about individuals, it's all about people, and getting them to work together is usually the key to success.
So obviously we talk and we look at football clubs as the main measure, as you've said, is the on-field performance. But there are so many other things that define what success looks like. You obviously have a lot of stakeholders. You have the shareholder value. You have fans and their understanding and acceptance of the clubs and its strategy and its position. What are some of the measures that you use if you go towards the end of the year that you are actually looking back and reflecting about how the organisation is performing? So put the on-field performance stuff to the side, because that's obviously the one we always point to. What else are you looking at that marks that you can walk away, Paul, from the year and go, yeah, that was a successful season outside of the traditional on-field stuff?
Well, ultimately, we want to be profitable. We want to be sustainable from a financial point of view without having to rely on a wealthy owner to help us be sustainable. And for far too long, particularly in professional football in England, we've almost patted ourselves on the back for losing a little less money each year. We should actually be congratulating ourselves when we make a profit, not when we lose less. So I think creating a profitable enterprise is important. For the longer term, for the owner, we want to create greater shareholder value, greater enterprise value. So we're looking to build our brand. We're looking to create more sustainable revenue streams. We want, obviously, ultimately, our fans to be spending more with us, but that's a very careful balance, because fans don't like to feel as if they're constantly being put upon to spend more money. But ultimately, if you think about it logically, our fans are our customers in that context, and we want our customers to spend more money with us because they're the most logical place for us to drive revenues from. But that has to be done sensitively, so it doesn't feel constantly like people are being asked to put their hands in their pockets. And obviously, ultimately, we want to diversify those revenue streams for that very reason. So making ourselves an entertainment venue beyond football is also important. What can we stage? Pop concerts, conferences, events, other non-match day activities? Are we able to create new venues? As I said, we're building here a £7 million fan zone that will be a fantastic venue for our supporters on a match day to enjoy food and drink and socialising with each other. But in between matches, what can we give that venue in terms of content? Could it be an indoor concert venue? Could it be hired out for private events, parties, celebrations of various kinds? These are all the areas where we need to drive greater revenue in order to become more sustainable, less reliant on our owner. And, we always say that the revenue that we drive, less the cost that we incur, is effectively what we can put on the pitch. So there's a real desire for us to constantly explain to our fan base that we need to drive revenues and we need to keep our costs at the lowest possible level, because the gap is what they can then expect to see on the pitch week to week. And in that sense, football becomes a very simple model again. It's what we earn versus what we spend, is really the talent that's going to be available to us to entertain people on a weekly basis. But again, these are long-term strategies for a club of our size. We need to constantly look at how we can innovate, use technology, make the operational processes smoother, which reduces our cost base. So in terms of measures of success, yes, of course, on the field will drive a lot of that, but making ourselves more financially sustainable for the long term and for future generations will come a very, very close second.
The driving incremental and alternative revenue streams is a hot topic on everyone's lips across the entire sports industry, but obviously with football. Have you found any areas that actually have meaningful impact there? Do you see that? Because are they all sort of marginal, but the sum of all of its parts is going to have the impact? Because naturally, the greatest revenues for a club come from the media rights and then from match day and sponsorship in various orders, depending on which organisation you look at. But is it all the sum of all parts, or are there particular areas of growth that you think can really help to achieve some of those goals you talked about?
I think first and foremost, you always have to remind yourself, if you're running a football club, that ultimately the results on the pitch are going to drive so much of your success, so much of your revenue. And if you lose sight of that, you lose focus on that, then you're probably heading into pretty choppy waters. So we always start with the football. We always start with the focus that we need to do well on the pitch in order to doing well as an organization. So for example, if you're looking to host 10 pop concerts a year on your pitch, and your pitch ends up being a muddy quagmire and your team then can't perform on that pitch, you're probably not helping your overall business and your overall performance. So we always start with the football, get that right, prioritize that, and then what else around that can we build in order to make that better? And, in our case, a small number of large events on in and around the stadium are an important part of how we can develop the business going forward. Building out our merchandise areas, because fans have an increasing appetite for good quality merchandise with the club's name on it. So how can we do that? Building our brand internationally, going on more and more international tours. Last summer we were in Japan. The summer before that we were in the US. Building the fan base, selling more merchandise, driving more ticket revenue. How can we actually become a more regular appearer on UK live broadcast, because there's value there for us? So can we make our environment more attractive to the broadcast partners of the Premier League? And when those broadcasters arrive here, what can we do to make them want to come back and visit our ground and show our games live again? So there's lots of ways in which you can drive revenue that don't necessarily have to impact on your core business and therefore the performance of the team. But it's hard, and you constantly have to innovate. You constantly have to look for ways of being prepared to be different, look for ways of actually utilizing this enormous asset called a stadium, which is very often only used 20, 24, 25 times a season for its main purpose, which is football matches. That leaves a lot of scope for you to use that building for other things. But how can they fit into the calendar so that they don't impact on the core business, which is the football? And this is the challenge that every club, every sports franchise in the world has when it comes to utilizing assets like stadiums, which are hugely expensive to build, to run, to open, but at the same time use so infrequently. It's a real conundrum for all of us.
So one of the things that seems to be fueling everyone's decision these days, but particularly has got a lot of coverage from your side, Paul, is the use of data to inform some of the decision making that you make for both on the pitch performance, but also off the pitch performance. Can you just talk us through some of the specifics on how you use data to inform? Firstly, let's start with on the pitch. How you're using that to inform decisions on talent and whether it be performance in the club or transfers to look at. And then I want to bring it to the off the pitch after that. But let's start with the on the pitch. What's some of the major things you're looking at from a data perspective to inform your decisions?
Well, I think there's no secret about us being a data-led club when it comes to recruiting players. But what is secret is how we do it. So I'm not going to go into the detail of that. But sure. But certainly data is very, very important when it comes to finding new players. Partly because the world's a big place when it comes to talent, and it's impossible to have a scouting network of human beings placed all over the world watching football every day and individual players every day. It would just be too costly an enterprise to look at it like that. So we use data to try and narrow the field of interest for us when it comes to prospective recruitment of players. And the more data we use, the more reliable it becomes. The more reliable it becomes, the more confident we become in using that data. And so, for us, it's a combination of the data starting the process. We then obviously use a small number of scouts to verify what the data is telling us. We do a lot of work on personality profiling to make sure that, if the data is right and the quality of the player is consistent with the data that we're using, then are they the right sort of character to bring into our squad, into our club? Do they fit our values? Are they going to be enhancing to the team dynamic and the group dynamic as well as the technical dynamic? And then, of course, it's then about the money. It's about the finances. And, we always have a saying here, it's never about the money until it's about the money. You can find the right player and he's got all the right attributes and he fits the personality of the club, but ultimately, can you afford him? Is he or she going to be the sort of player that you can bring into the club at the price that is actually going to fit our model, in a wage structure that fits with the rest of the squad? Are the agent fees going to be commensurate with what we're prepared to pay, and so on? So, recruitment is a very, very complex business these days, partly because we are all about humans, partly because it is a global market, partly because elite athletes are expensive, and significantly because it's hugely competitive. We won't be the only club looking at a particular player at a particular point in time. We have a particular methodology and a particular strategy that we follow. So that actually makes our field of vision a little bit narrower than some. But that doesn't mean to say other clubs are not as smart and not as determined to find the best talent in the same way as we are. Data is a very, very important part of the sports business from a recruitment point of view. It's also a very important part of the sports business from a preparation and a recovery point of view. We're constantly looking at data for how the athletes are performing. What can we do to make that performance better? Should they sleep more? Should we be flying to games on a different type of aircraft? Should we be flying to games at all? Is the train better? If we're taking the bus, what kind of facilities does the bus have? When are the players eating? What are they eating? All of this actually becomes, data driven and requires a huge amount of understanding of some of the key markers and indicators that influence elite athlete performance. And, in our case, we take it a step further because the team behind the team are just as important to us as the athletes, because they've got to create the environment for the athletes to perform. So how are we feeding our non-athletic staff? How are we ensuring that they get the right rest? How are we ensuring that their mental health is at the peak of its powers in order for them to perform at the highest level to help the athletes? So, data is driving so much of what we do on and off the pitch. And that's before we even start looking at fan data and how we segment our supporter databases and how we can drive more young people into the club, how we can segment our ticket pricing to absolutely ensure fans are getting great value for money, but we're not falling behind in terms of the revenue tables. So data, Nick, is a very, very big part of professional sport all over the world, and none more so than in the Premier League.
Chris, I want to ask you a question about data. Obviously, we talk a lot about it in our previous discussions, but in terms of some of the points that Paul's made, it's clear that someone in a leadership position gets a lot of benefit from understanding what sort of data they're getting and have access to interpret some of the things, that data, to make really good decisions. Right. Just what's your view on that? Does the CEO and the leader, ultimate leader, do they need that knowledge, that deep depth knowledge, or can they rely on their team members to kind of distill all that and basically give them like, okay, the data's telling us X, go and do it? Or do they need to be able to get into the weeds of the data a little bit sometimes to make sure they're getting the right information?
Yeah, as we've talked about before, Nick, data is key. And Paul's just reinforced that. And it drives everything, right? So I think you really got to build that framework. Like, what do you need to know? And how can you get that information, and then how do you interpret it, right? So it's a process even when it comes to the data, because there's endless streams of data out there. So starting with what you want to know, whether it be athlete performance, whether it be support staff performance, whether it be fan likes and dislikes, whatever it is, what do you want to know? And then where is the data? How can you bring it in? And having folks really across the board. I think leadership drives that. What's the key information leadership needs? But having everybody understanding what's important and what's not, what fits in. Otherwise, you'll just get inundated with data and risk making bad decisions just based off of being overwhelmed by the data that's out there. So you have to have a way to sort through it. You have to have a way to match it up to what you want to know. But, make no mistake. I mean, from a leadership standpoint, leadership, strategy, execution, all those things, it's all about decision-making, and decision-making is based on data. And so how you're wrapping that into what you're doing is really key in terms of being able to achieve what you're trying to achieve.
So, Paul, I want to shift the conversation a little bit to what's been happening on the women's football side in particular, because the Super League's had a lot of coverage of its growth. It's recently signed a new set of broadcast deals to hopefully expand the revenue streams of that to make it more sustainable. You've, basically set up a temporary stadium in Brighton for the team initially, which I believe it's currently playing in Crawley, about 35 k's away from the away from Brighton, if I'm not mistaken. So could you just talk a bit about how you're approaching that to determine when you pull some levers there? Because I think you're seeing various clubs look at when do we bring games into the main stadium, because obviously it doesn't make sense if you're not getting certain crowd sizes to then put them in a huge stadium. Or how are you balancing all that to understand how to approach what you're doing with the women's league? Is obviously it's as fast evolving as we've seen in our recent history within the Premier League.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's really important for us to be in women and girls football. We see it as the final growth opportunity really in the game. And if you look at TV rights in domestic TV rights for the Premier League, at the moment they're very strong, but it's hard in a country of our size to grow them significantly further. Internationally, there's still more growth. But the men's game largely is at a mature stage. The women's game is not, and therefore for us it was the right strategic opportunity for us to pursue. We're, like a lot of clubs, looking at how we can build our attendances, how we can help professionalize women and girls football to the level that the men's game has got to. That's not to say the men's game is better and the women's game is worse. It just simply they're at different stages of their growth cycle. Every club is adopting a different strategy for women's football in this country. Some have been involved in women's football, Arsenal, for example, for many decades. And as a consequence, they've got a great fan base. They've got fantastic players. They're arguably, alongside Chelsea and Manchester City, leading the pack. And they've got good crowds and good sponsors. We're at a much earlier stage in our development of the women's game, but our strategy is going to be different. And we're looking to build a women's specific stadium to sit alongside what could be called our main stadium, if you like, or the only stadium in our case that we've got. And we believe that that's a better option for us than to continue to play at Crawley, which is obviously a club in its own sense. The stadium there is terrific and we've been well looked after. But just from a basic point of view, it's red. We're a blue club. It doesn't help with our brand building. Typically, our women's team are playing on that pitch that's in that stadium after Crawley's men's team have played, as happened this weekend. So the surface will not necessarily be in peak condition, although it's in very good condition at the moment. It's not necessarily ideal. And if you look at the stadium that we use here, the Amex, it's far too big at the moment for our women's team. And most athletes, whatever level they are, want to be able to feel that when they turn up in their arena, particularly their home arena, that it's going to be full. And, we're attracting crowds here at the moment of anything between 2,000 and 8,000. Well, in a 32,000 stadium, it's still going to feel pretty empty and therefore not highly motivational for the athletes. So we want to try and build a women's specific stadium, partly to right size the audience and allow growth over a period of time. So in an ideal world, the stadium will be modular and will grow with the team. And secondly, we want to make sure that we respect the athletes. So if I look at the American Express Stadium here, it's a world-class stadium, but it's been designed for male athletes. If I look at the dressing rooms, the locker rooms, we've got 2 or 3 cubicles. Well, if you've got a team of female athletes, you're going to have 20 athletes. You're going to have a support staff, maybe of another 10 women. That's 30 women at half time looking to use maybe 2 cubicles. That isn't showing the level of respect to female athletes that they deserve. It's not geared towards high performance, because if you run out of time for everybody to use the facilities at half time and athletes are going onto the pitch, needing to still, use the toilet, then that's not helping their performance. That's not helping their concentration levels, all the rest of it. And there are many, many other aspects. If I look at this stadium, which, as I said, is a world-class stadium, that means that it's not tailored towards the needs of female athletes. And if we want to take women's football seriously, and we do, and we are, then we've actually got to look at our facilities in a different way. So for us, rather than modifying this stadium, when we know we're a long way away from an audience being big enough to fill it, can we make it economically viable to build a stadium designed for our women's team that may then have secondary uses, our under-21 men's team, the local university teams, local school cup finals, so we can make it a much more community-led facility at a much lower cost, but at the same time prioritizing and making number one tenant our women's professional team and the teams that support that particular group. So different way of thinking. It's a longer term strategy. It's a slightly more expensive strategy than loaning out somebody else's stadium. But we feel it will actually accelerate our women and girls program. And at some point in the future, we may well harmonize our men's and women's teams in one stadium. But along the way, we'd have learned a lot about what it will take to modify the American Express Stadium to better suit female athletes. And we feel that's a better strategy for us in the short, medium and longer term.
Yet another complex thing to be thinking and working through when you're looking from a strategy perspective. Chris, I'm curious to talk. We talk about women's sports more and more these days in the industry, and now the data is really showing us how meaningful and impactful it is, the following, the fan engagement around it. Just from the work you've done around fan engagement, Chris, and your team have. How big an opportunity do you think the women's sports side is, and how much of an investment does it continue to need from organizations like Paul's?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge opportunity, and I think globally we're seeing that recognition. I think the challenge becomes how do you support it at the right point? And I think Paul covered a number of key things. There may be the tendency for folks to kind of jump on the bandwagon and try to treat women's sports like men's sports, and maybe at some point in the future, you can harmonize that. But women's sports are sports in and of themselves. There's considerations around that. There's different audiences around it, different needs within, as Paul just mentioned, stadiums. So taking a woman-focused approach, I think is very innovative of what Paul's describing. But I think that's really where you need to be, and there's a lot there. So I think the recognition is where it needs to be. And I think that the data is starting to support it. Even if you look at what we're doing with the 50 most marketable, I mean, we start to have more and more women on the list, women higher up on the list. But what we struggle with is kind of legacy kind of measures that are built around men's sports and are built around traditional broadcast type of media, that type of visibility. And so there's a ton of potential out there. Tapping into that potential is what's really going to take kind of innovative thought and treating it as such that women sports are different than men's sports in some ways. I think will be the key to accelerating that value for people to realize.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously there, as Paul said earlier, there is a lot of organizations on very different strategies and approaches to how to approach this, particularly from an organization, say in the Premier League, where you have to balance the performance of the men's side alongside coming up with a dedicated strategy. Paul, just one of the things you mentioned earlier was about the need to make sure one of your key measures of success at a club level is about trying to run a profitable organization. How do you therefore then make decisions around investment around women's football? Because obviously there is There's loads of conjecture as to what the growth path it is on. At the same time, we're seeing the media rights landscape really change in how it's adopting the traditional media rights approach that actually has been such a strong funder of the Premier League's growth for so long. Just how do you determine the amount of investment you're making in the women's football? How far, I guess, longer term are you really looking?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, as I said earlier, it's the right thing to do. So, if you determine it's the right thing to do from a moral point of view, from a brand point of view, in our case, from a community point of view, then you've got to find a way to fund it and make it work. And I think, there are lots of different ways to fund any business, and women's football is no different. We've taken a longer term approach. We understand that, right now we're going to be investing money and losing money, but it is an investment. So from that point of view, we're investing in the future of our sport. We're investing in the future of our club, investing in the future of women and girls sport generally, which I think is really important. I think also you have to understand as well that, as Chris said, we're talking very often about the same sport, but different versions of it. We don't compare women's tennis or women's golf or even women's rugby or women's cricket in the same way that over the last 10 years we've compared women's football with men's football. They are sports within their own right and highly respected, and women's football thankfully has moved along the same curve to the point where you can appreciate parts of the women's game and the girls' game as just simply being different to the men's game. Maybe not as physical, maybe not as fast, but certainly very technical, very entertaining. It's opened up for us, and I know for other clubs, a complete new audience. Initially we all went into women's football thinking that we were going to move fans across from the men's side and they'd end up watching the women's team as well. Well, some have, but a relatively small number, I think, compared to what we originally thought. And what we've actually done is we brought in a new audience who are more comfortable in an environment watching women's football, where the stadium dynamics are a little different. Hopefully in the future, as I mentioned, clubs like us will build women-specific stadiums, which means that maybe the food and drink offer in the stadium can be different because the audience is different. Here at the American Express Stadium, we're geared up to selling many, many, many thousands of pints of beer per game and many, many thousands of giant meat pies. Well, the women and girls audience is very different in our experience to what we attract for a typical men's game. That means they're probably going to want a different food and beverage offer. And a new stadium with new concessions designed in a different way will enable us to do that. So from a marketing point of view, we've got an opportunity to almost design a new product within the same sport and educate people that they're going to be seeing familiar aspects to the sport that they love, but also new and different features, which they'll enjoy just as much. And, from that point of view, it's a really exciting opportunity, I think, for the whole sport worldwide, which is why the growth of women's football is taking off. But you have to look at it over the longer term. And if you're expecting quick returns, a quick return on your investment is probably not going to come. And, but longer term, bigger pie, bigger opportunity. And, we hope and we think and we expect that we will see those returns over a much longer period.
Couple final questions before we wrap things up, Paul. I wanted to take a step back now and look more towards, I know a lot of clubs, a lot of leagues, a lot of sports properties. I've absolutely been interested in how you've run the club and how the club is operating, how effectively, efficiently, successfully, et cetera it is. A lot of people looking to you and looking your way to see how that's all done. Where do you look? Are you looking at spending a lot of time looking at other clubs, other properties outside of sports? Where do you perhaps find some forms of inspiration on how you operate the business and organization you're running?
Always looking at other businesses and other sports. I mean, I spend a lot of time looking at the Formula One teams, particularly when it comes to performance and precision engineering and the way they build the support staff around the drivers. I find Formula One fascinating from that perspective. So, I've been lucky enough to have a couple of interactions with Formula One teams where I've got to learn and understand their business. Always look at other Premier League clubs, always look at clubs across Europe. We don't have a license here of doing everything right. As I mentioned earlier, the progress looks like it's in a straight line. The reality is quite different on and off the field. So, we make some missteps and we learn from those missteps. We're not afraid to try different things. So we'll look to North American sport as well, particularly when it comes to fan experience type strategies where, particularly the NBA, the NFL, have got a fantastic reputation for, making sure that when their fans come to watch a live event, that the whole experience is as good as it can be. It means if it doesn't go well on the pitch or on the court or on the ice rink, if it's NHL, then actually the fan still goes away feeling like their investment in that franchise has been a good one. And we can learn a lot from that. But I think also outside of sport, sometimes you have to look at other businesses for innovation and management-led strategies where you can actually learn a lot. And, we often talk about football and sport generally being different, but at the end of the day, we're a business as well. We have to be sustainable. We have to ultimately drive profit. We have to grow our enterprise value. We have to serve customers. Ultimately, for us, they're fans, and therefore there's a different approach required because fans, particularly in football in England, don't like to be seen or treated or called customers. But ultimately, they do expect to be treated well. They do expect value for money. They do expect to have their loyalty as a fan rewarded in some way. So there's much we can learn from businesses outside of sport. And I certainly have no qualms whatsoever of actually looking at what others are doing and seeing if I can adapt it for our business and make it better, or sometimes just simply copy it, because there's a lot of really, really talented people that work in professional sport, not outside of football as well as inside of football, and also a lot of other businesses that we can learn from. So always looking for inspiration, always looking particularly at conferences to hear people speak and see if there's one little nugget that you can pick up that you can then bring back and adapt and tailor for your own business.
Chris, I mean, you obviously work across a lot of different sectors, a lot of different industries. Are there any that you think, hey, sports should spend more time looking at that sector, that industry, to get that little edge that Paul's talking about?
Yeah, I mean, from a maturity standpoint, I think the hospitality industry is a great industry to look at. Very, very similar, although it may not seem similar, but, I mean, historically, the experience has been around the hotel, let's just say. And you can relate that to it being around a stadium for sports. But from a loyalty program standpoint, from an extended experience, not just the room stay, but what else is there in the hotel? What else is there in the local area? How are visitors engaged with when they're not staying there to entice them to come back or use that brand when they travel in other cases? I think that's a more mature industry right now, I would say, that a lot of lessons can be learned from. As far as kind of going through it at the same time, I think healthcare is kind of can share learnings. They're in the same spot where if you want to look at the clinical staff, the doctors, the surgeons, they kind of align with the world-class athlete, and then how the rest of the support staff within a hospital or hospital system needs to really be synergized, and everybody kind of know their part in order to drive that patient experience. And so they're kind of going through trying to change to a more of a consumer-driven model. And I think that, they're kind of going through a lot of the same challenges and learnings that the sports industry is going through as well. I would say, food and beverage industry as well as probably put them up there with hospitality, because they've been doing this for a while. They've got a lot of, they're not just looking at existing customers, but they're really starting to focus a lot on their foresight teams and understanding where trends are going and how to get ahead of those trends by really understanding their customers and what, cultural trends may be, or new kind of, food types of trends may be, and getting ahead of that. So there's a lot of investment in the food and beverage industry right now within kind of looking at foresight. So I think that's another area that the sports industry could look at. And Paul, you hit on something when you were talking about, even the difference in food preferences or beverage preferences within the women's sport than the men's sport. And that is what a lot of, we have a couple of clients within the food and beverage consumer packaged good industry. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're looking at what type of segments do we have for our different customer base, and how do we evolve our product to meet those specific needs, down to literally the amount of pepperoni that are on, frozen pizza based off of data that they're tracking, right? So a lot of investment in kind of the foresights types of teams within food and beverage.
I mean, for me, it stands to reason if you've identified that you've got a different audience for women's football, for example, then to be serving them the same things that you'd serve the audience for men's football doesn't make any sense. You've already identified that it's a different audience, and therefore to assume they'd want the same thing as a different audience, it's just an illogical thought process. It may well end up that you have some crossover, of course, but if you can actually go to that new audience and ask them what they want, find out what it is that when they come to a women's game that they want to eat and drink, and what they want to experience, and how they want the music to be. Do they want it super loud in the stadium like we do for the men's game, or is it a different kind of vibe that they're looking for? Then this is just actually basic marketing. It's basic sort of business management. And, for a long time, I think sport has been almost nervous to step away from what it knows into an area where actually sometimes you've got to do a little bit of harder work to understand exactly what your fan base, your customer base really wants. So, right. I think it's exciting. I personally think it's the next challenge for us to be prepared to be different, and to be prepared to look at women's sport and women's football in particular, in our case, in a slightly different way. It shouldn't alarm us or frighten us. It should inspire us.
Some great points there from both of you there. Paul, I have to say there are a few of our team members at SportsPro are very devout Seagulls fans and have been raving for some time of their how impressed they are with how you've been running the club and under Tony Bloom's tenure as well. So I think what I'm very interested to see is how you keep continuing to do what you do, because it's clearly been a great journey to this point. The bar keeps getting raised, the more success you have on the pitch, which means the goals change off the pitch as well. So, but look, really thank you for fitting us in your schedule, finding some time to share your take and your insight into how to approach running an organisation in sports. But that is all we've got time for. Thanks very much, Paul, for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate it.